Began with the protagonist in the field, using magic to level a huge area of land. The workers around him watched in surprise. After all, it was unusual to see a nobleman devoting himself to such a task. When he finished, he returned home, greeted by the girls he had been living with lately. As soon as they saw him, they commented that he looked exhausted. He knew that, but he felt it was his responsibility to help whenever possible, even if it was ironic to think that deep down, he had never stopped being someone used to an office routine. The girls quickly understood what he meant. Then he decided to change the subject, though he still couldn't forget that it had already been 10 years since that day, when his life was completely ordinary. Back then, he would return home from work after a long day, completely worn out. Even with his body begging for rest, he forced himself to get up and make something to eat. When the meal was ready, he sat at the table, but exhaustion overcame him, and his eyes closed. He thought he had only dozed off for a moment, but when he opened them again, he realized everything around him was strange. The surroundings, the food, even the reflection he saw on a plate showed a face that wasn't his own. The first thing he thought was that he was dreaming, but it felt far too real. He tried to go back to sleep, hoping to wake up at home. But then, a man appeared, calling him and saying he needed to introduce himself to some acquaintance. He was confused, unsure how to react, and the man added that he was his youngest son. That left him completely disoriented. He didn't even know his own name. After a few seconds of silence, a boy appeared. Many people called him Eric. He approached and thanked everyone for attending his older brother's wedding. Then he introduced the protagonist to the youngest brother, calling him Wendelin Von Benno. Upon hearing that name, the protagonist finally understood who he was. He then asked Eric the reason for the celebration. Eric replied that they were celebrating the wedding of Kurt, the eldest, who had worried their father by not yet finding a wife. Now that he was marrying Amelie, who was also a noble, the whole family felt relieved and happy. Wendelin understood the situation better and asked if, since Amelie was a noble, they had also become noble. Eric confirmed it, but reminded him that they were already part of the nobility. The protagonist then left, still not quite understanding how that world worked. He was trapped in the body of a 5-year-old child, but at least he could understand their language, and the food was good, which was a relief. Since his family was noble and he was the third son, perhaps he could enjoy some advantages. The next day, he found himself at the table with his father and other family members. The food, however, was completely different: thin soup and hard bread. The place itself was in poor condition. Nothing like the wealth of noble. Curious, he asked about Eric, and his father replied that he had gone fishing. Wendelin ran after his brother, and when he found him, he wanted to understand why everything had changed so much. Eric explained that, despite being noble, they were very poor. The night before, they had made a huge effort to appear richer than they were, just to impress Amelie's family. They had spent a lot of money, and now everything was back to reality. They ate what they could, and had to find their own means of survival. While they talked, another brother appeared, complaining that he hadn't been included in any of it. In just a few moments, even more brothers showed up, and they all started talking about two who hadn't attended the wedding. Wendelin then realized that he was actually the 8th child in the family. Days later, he found out that they lived in the kingdom of Gemmel, a place divided into several regions. The capital housed most of the population, around 1 million people, while large commercial cities were dominated by powerful nobles. His family, on the other hand, lived in the most remote region, with only 80,000 inhabitants, and the future there seemed uncertain. During a walk, he saw his brothers saying goodbye. He approached quickly, asking what was happening. They explained that, since Kurt's wedding, they had decided to leave the family, since they wouldn't inherit anything valuable, as Kurt would receive most of it. They chose to take some money and leave, to try a new life in another city, perhaps as adventurers, using the skills they had. Since Wendelin was still a child, he would stay. Eric advised him not to be lazy and to aim for something better. He said goodbye to his brothers and went straight to the library, looking for something to study. He searched the shelves but didn't find anything interesting. While searching, a box fell, revealing a sphere and some papers. Curious, he read the contents and discovered that the sphere was a crystal ball capable of detecting magical abilities. The instructions said that everyone has mana, but only 1 in every 10,000 people could actually cast spells. With nothing to lose, he decided to try it. He placed the sphere on the table, followed the written steps, and tried to activate magic, even though he didn't really know what to do. For a moment, nothing happened. Disappointment hit, but then the sphere lit up completely. The intensity of the light was so strong that it attracted someone from afar. Wendelin was stunned. When the sphere returned to normal, he reread the instructions. If it shone in many colors, it meant that the magical power was immense, and the person should find a tutor as soon as possible. Still surprised by the discovery, he tried to find more information about magic in the library, but found nothing. At that moment, his father entered, and Wendelin took the opportunity to ask if there were any other books. However, his father said he didn't know how to read, and that those were all the books they had. Then he asked the boy to fetch firewood from the forest instead of messing around in the room. Once he entered the forest, the protagonist started trying to use magic, even though he had no idea how. As he tried, suddenly a man fell right in front of him, making him jump in fright. The stranger introduced himself as a magician and said he had been drawn there by something. Even with that explanation, the protagonist was still terrified. At that moment, he noticed a rock had rolled near a huge boar. The animal saw it and in an instant charged at him. Panicking, the protagonist started to run, but the magician grabbed him and told him to try to visualize wind magic. Confused, he replied that he didn't know what that meant and that he was terrified. The magician calmly explained that it was necessary to focus on his mana and clearly visualize what he wanted to do. Overcome by fear, all the protagonist could think about was stopping the boar. Then, unexpectedly, a gust of wind burst from his hands and hit the animal, leaving it stunned. Surprised by what had just happened, he heard the magician congratulating him on his first spell. After that, with a simple gesture, the man conjured a powerful gust of wind that threw the boar against several trees, leaving it lifeless. At that moment, the magician introduced himself as Alfred, a former court mage of the Duchy of Blage. He said that he wanted to teach the protagonist everything about magic, promising to make him a better mage than he had ever been. The next day, while with his family, the protagonist remembered his conversation with Alfred. He still didn't understand why he had been chosen to learn magic. He said he had no money, but Alfred assured him that he wasn't doing it for financial reasons. His true desire was to have a disciple. However, he asked that the use of magic be kept a secret. The request left the protagonist deep in thought. He knew that if anyone discovered he could use magic, they might strip him of his position as the heir to his older brother. So he watched his brother during dinner, not knowing how to avoid future family conflicts. Later, he had his first training session with Alfred. The mage asked him to clasp his hands together to channel his magical power, something common among mages to increase their strength. The protagonist was surprised by the coldness of Alfred's hands, but soon refocused on controlling his mana. He felt a strong energy coursing through his body. Alfred then declared that he hadn't been mistaken. The boy had a lot of mana, and his potential was far from being fully realized. Meanwhile, the protagonist's father and Kurt noticed that the magic orbs were elsewhere. They assumed he was trying to experiment and laughed, believing he was disappointed not to have discovered any power. In the days that followed, the protagonist continued training with more advanced spells, learning at an impressive pace. Alfred was increasingly amazed by the boy's progress. To hide the meetings, the protagonist brought home baskets full of vegetables, saying he had found them in the forest. The family was delighted, as it had been a long time since they'd seen so much fresh food. Even so, the father was suspicious and asked how he'd managed to find such rare vegetables. Jokingly, he asked if he had used wind magic to get to them. He laughed right after, joined by the mother. But Kurt remained silent, watching the protagonist with a look full of envy. A few days later, Alfred took the protagonist into the sky to practice detection magic, a wind technique that allows one to sense the presence of living beings through the waves they emit. He concentrated and managed to detect a bird hidden in the forest. Without hesitation, he launched a stone, propelling it with magic, and hit the target with precision. Later, Alfred was impressed with the boy's skill. He even seasoned the hunted bird with wasabi found in the forest, which intrigued the mage. He tasted it and, despite the strong flavor, found it delicious. During the meal, Alfred warned that the deepest part of the forest was dangerous. There, extremely strong monsters lived, but there were also valuable herbs and resources that attracted many adventurers and caused the deaths of many of them. After eating, the protagonist returned to training and told his master that Kurt had been watching him. Alfred said it was normal since he was probably suspicious of his brother's newfound talents. Besides, he might fear being replaced as heir one day. The protagonist replied that he had no interest in taking that place, but he felt lost about what to do. That's when Alfred suggested that he become an adventurer. He said this path suited someone with a free spirit and would also allow him to explore the world. The boy started imagining all the possibilities and places he could visit. At that moment, Alfred turned his back to hide his arm, which was beginning to exude a dark energy. He was worried but didn't have time to think about it. That same night, the protagonist told his family that he wanted to be an adventurer and planned to enter the Adventurers Academy when he turned 12. Kurt was excited, but the father, though supportive, explained that they didn't have enough money to pay for the studies. The next day, he spoke to Alfred, who suggested he work at the guild, selling simple items to pay for the academy. But before that, he needed to learn how to travel long distance. He said that with flight magic, that would be possible. Holding him by the arms, Alfred took him flying through the sky. They flew so high that they passed the clouds, and the boy was enchanted by the view of the entire world before his eyes. That same night, Alfred suffered intensely because he couldn't contain the dark magic that was uncontrollably flowing from his body. The next day, the protagonist was already able to float. When he mentioned to Alfred that he still didn't know how to fly properly, the master told him he had already learned the basics and now needed to continue practicing on his own. He didn't like the idea very much, but seeing Alfred's tired expression, he decided not to complain. A few hours later, during dinner, the father said they had seen an undead in the forest and asked everyone to be careful. He explained that these beings are cold, senseless, and pale in appearance. Over time, they lose their sanity and become aggressive zombies. The protagonist was startled by the news and worried thought of Alfred. That night, he tried to fly to where his master was, but because he still didn't have full control of the magic, he ended up falling to the ground. Alfred appeared and wanted to know what he was doing there. The boy, alarmed, said that there was an undead in the area and that he was in danger. But Alfred replied that there was no danger because he already knew about it. The boy refused to accept this until he heard the truth from the master himself. Alfred admitted that he himself was an undead, and that everything had started 5 years ago, when the Duke's eldest son, whom he served, had fallen seriously ill. His father decided to go to the cursed forest to look for the medicines they needed. But even taking an army with him, the monsters were too numerous, and they couldn't defeat them. So, using the most powerful magic he possessed, he ultimately sacrificed his own life to protect the Duke. Even so, he left some unfinished business, which is why he chose to remain as an undead. He explained to the protagonist that if an undead manages to accomplish what he left unfinished, he can finally rest in peace. In his case, the goal was to find someone worthy of inheriting the 30 years of magical knowledge he had accumulated, and it was at that moment that he felt the presence of the boy. He was only 5 years old at the time, but now time was too short, and Alfred wanted to know if the boy was truly the right person. So, he proposed that the protagonist perform a final test to use holy magic to purify him. This meant freeing him from the curse, which would also end his existence. However, the protagonist refused because that would mean destroying him. But Alfred insisted, saying that the curse was corroding his body more and more, and that he could no longer stop it himself. He also didn't want to put anyone at risk, and thought that was the best solution. Then, he taught the protagonist how to use holy magic. Seconds later, a light surrounded them both. Alfred felt the magic start to act on his body, and asked the boy to increase its power. But the boy didn't want to do it, still trying to keep his teacher from disappearing. Alfred then asked the boy to remember everything they had lived through in those last days, how he had helped him grow and become a better person. But now it was him who needed the boy's help. With tears in his eyes, the protagonist said goodbye to the teacher, and, with all his strength, began the purification process. Alfred praised him for such a powerful spell, and said that one day he would become a great sorcerer. He also asked him to keep giving his best, and, before vanishing, said that he hoped to see him again in another world. With that, he disappeared, leaving the protagonist alone and devastated by the loss of someone who had been more than a master, his best friend. A few years passed, and the protagonist was finally ready to enter the academy. He said goodbye to home and set out for the city where he would begin his journey as an adventurer. After days of travel, he arrived at the place where other young people were already gathering. The protagonist, however, felt uncomfortable. For the last 7 years, he had kept his distance from everyone to avoid any problems related to his magical power, so now he didn't really know how to act around others. When it was his turn to introduce himself, he noticed strange looks from everyone around him, which made him even more uncomfortable. The teacher handed them a registration sheet. They had to fill in the names of the members of their groups, because in a month, they would begin practical lessons, all done in teams. This worried the protagonist, as he didn't know anyone. When lunchtime came, he sat alone, and that made him sad, knowing he needed to socialize more. At a nearby table, 2 classmates, Louise and Suzanne, were talking about him. They had heard rumors that his magical power was greater than that of many experienced adventurers, and that this was one of the reasons he had been accepted into the academy. They also said that his former magic teacher had refused to train him because there was nothing left to teach someone like him. While they were talking, a boy named Elvin approached and suggested an idea. Since many people wanted to be in a group with the protagonist, they could team up and try to join his group. Elvin was a promising knight, and both he and Louise and Suzanne were heirs to noble family. Combining that with the protagonist's magical power, they could stand out easily. Meanwhile, the protagonist was still looking for a chance to connect with someone, but he noticed that no one approached him. Little did he know, the other students were actually competing to see who could invite him to their group first. The teacher announced that some students hadn't completed their registration and suggested they go to the bioterium to get some extra funds. Since they were still young, it would be better to do that task in groups. Once again, this bothered the protagonist because he still wasn't part of any group. Elvin commented to the girls that the protagonist was probably analyzing who was the strongest before deciding whom to join. So he decided they should hunt as many creatures as possible to catch his attention. The next day, Elvin's group managed to gather 3 fairly large prey, surpassing the other. But everything changed when the protagonist arrived at the site and, opening his magic bag, revealed huge fangs in a quantity far greater than the others had managed. Everyone was stunned. Seeing this, the other groups gave up competing, as it seemed impossible for someone like him to even notice them. The protagonist received his payment for the hunts and thought about inviting someone to eat, but felt sad to realize no one was around. That night, Elvin spoke with his two companions, and they confided that they had something in common. All three had been rejected by their families because they were not the eldest children, meaning they would not inherit their siblings' title. Even so, they discovered that they possessed above-average mana. It wasn't enough to cast spells, but it was enough to strengthen their bodies and make them better warriors. Even so, Elvin didn't want to give up. He suggested they hunt even more monsters to attract the protagonist's attention. The next day, they went to the cursed forest in search of bigger prey. But halfway there, they were surrounded by a pack of wolves. Meanwhile, the protagonist was also in the forest, using detection magic to find prey. That was when he felt the presence of the wolves and his classmates. He saw an opportunity to make friends and decided to help them. When the boys were already exhausted and about to be seriously injured, he created a stone wall to protect them. After the scare, they apologized for trying to attract his attention in that way, admitting they weren't good enough to be in a group with him. The protagonist tried to explain something, but he was interrupted by the arrival of the teacher, who brought unexpected news. The city's duke had invited the class to a party at his residence. Everyone was excited and soon began talking about the invitation. However, some classmates remarked that there was no point in getting too excited, as the duke seemed interested only in the protagonist. The next day, the class attended the party, where many nobles were present. Duke Blade approached, but ignored the other. He addressed only the protagonist, saying it was a pleasure to meet a member of the local nobility. The protagonist apologized, explaining that his family lived very far away, making such a journey difficult for them. The Duke, understanding, replied that he need not apologize. He then invited the protagonist to discuss another matter in a more private setting. The protagonist agreed, but with one condition. He wanted to bring along the three companions he had recently helped, saying they were now part of his group. That statement took Elvin's group by surprise, as they hadn't expected such a thing. A few minutes later, they entered a room where the Duke introduced them to Blant Tak, the most powerful mage of his court, and also the former master of Alfred, the previous mage. Blant Tak greeted the protagonist and explained that Alfred had died years ago in the cursed forest. Using his magic, Blant Tak had managed to locate him, even after he had transformed into a still-talking undead. However, sometime later, Alfred's presence had suddenly vanished. This could only mean that Alfred had achieved his goal, something Blant Tak considered nearly impossible, as Alfred had been extremely strong, even stronger than himself. So the idea that someone even more powerful might exist seemed almost unreal. However, shortly after Alfred's disappearance, a boy appeared near the forest with an impressive power, which attracted a lot of attention. Moreover, he was carrying the bag that had belonged to Alfred. That item couldn't be stolen. It could only be used by someone to whom Alfred had personally passed it on. The protagonist was quite surprised that they knew all of this, and explained that Alfred had been his teacher, someone who had taught him many things. Blant Tak was pleased to hear that, and asked about Alfred's final moments. Upon hearing the question, the protagonist couldn't hold back his tears as he recalled what had happened, revealing that he himself had purified his master. This revelation deeply impressed both the Duke and the mage. After all, he had still been just a child at the time. Even so, Blant Tak sincerely thanked him, for thanks to that, Alfred was finally able to rest in peace. Hearing this, the protagonist felt much better, and added that he wanted to return the belongings of the 2,000 men who had died in that battle, since Alfred had kept them. A few hours later, Elvin's group was outside the room, discussing everything they had learned about their companion. They were still a bit stunned by the revelations. At that moment, the protagonist approached, apologizing for the delay and for not telling them about the group. Even so, they refused to join him, saying they were only there because they wanted to take advantage of him. Instead of being offended, the protagonist just laughed, since he had brought them along only to avoid facing the Duke alone. Because of that, he suggested that they form a real group, saying he wanted friends, since his teacher had always told him to enjoy this world to the fullest, and he wanted people to share that journey with. At that moment, they were interrupted by the arrival of the Duke, accompanied by Blant Tak. The Duke informed the protagonist that 20% of the value of what Alfred had left was now his. Therefore, he would receive 2,000 gold coins, as well as the mansion that had previously belonged to Alfred. The protagonist was stunned, as he now had a fortune and an important property in the city. A few days later, the protagonist was invited to one of his brother's weddings, which would take place in the royal capital. He decided to go along with his friends, traveling on a flying ship in the company of Blant Tak, who took the opportunity to have a drink. Seeing that Elvin was frightened by the flight, Blant Tak remarked that the only way that ship would fall was if a dragon attacked. And as if on cue, at that very moment, a storm arose, and an undead dragon appeared behind the vessel. The soldiers on board tried to calm the passenger, saying that Blant Tak would handle the monster. However, the mage confessed to the captain that he couldn't use purifying magic, which prevented him from confronting the creature. Even so, he introduced the protagonist as someone capable of dealing with. The revelation caught the boy by surprise, but since he was the only option, he accepted the challenge. Blantak gave him a few instructions, and the protagonist flew using his magic, approaching the dragon. He tried to cast a purification spell, but the creature responded with an attack, and he had to dodge several times. After managing to stabilize himself, he focused and fired a powerful blast of purifying magic, hitting the dragon squarely. The creature was then engulfed in a bright light, and within seconds, its presence disappeared, leaving only its skeleton, which began to disintegrate in the air. Blantak advised him to collect the bone, as they were very valuable, but what caught the protagonist's attention the most was a red crystal left behind by the dragon, which seemed to have something special. A few hours later, with the rest of the trip uneventful, the group finally arrived at the capital. As soon as they disembarked, Blantak introduced the protagonist to an old adventuring companion named Arterio, and said that he would go on alone from there, as he had business to attend to in the city. The protagonist and his friends began to discuss what they would do next, but they were interrupted by a group of soldiers who surrounded them. They became nervous, thinking they had done something wrong, until one of the soldiers thanked them for eliminating the undead dragon. He also said that they were there by order of the king, who wanted to bring them to the palace. This surprised the protagonist, and minutes later he was already entering the throne room. Several nobles watched him with curiosity. He still couldn't believe he was standing before the king, but even so, everyone bowed, and the king told them to rise. He was impressed to see someone so young achieve so much. Therefore, he thanked him deeply for protecting the ship and its crew, as well as for facing the dragon. As a reward, and in recognition of his efforts, he decided to grant him the title of baronet. Meanwhile, Blantak was talking to the protagonist's friends and his brother, commenting that he would probably receive the title, but that it wouldn't make him a noble of the capital. Since he didn't have his own territory like his father, he could still experience new adventure. However, what worried him most were all the protocols he would have to follow with the nobility. Meanwhile, the protagonist watched two nobles arguing in front of him over who had the right to claim the reward for the dragon's bones and crystal. He tried to explain that he didn't want that much money, but the two men ignored him, too busy arguing with each other. At that moment, an older man interrupted the discussion, reminding them that the king had also granted the protagonist the title of Emissary of Light, and that it was inappropriate to argue in front of him. Cleverly, the older man explained to the protagonist that he was the leader of the churches, and that he now wanted his support. Moreover, the two men who were arguing had different interests. One was the commander of the armed forces, who wanted to recruit him into the army, and the other handled finances and wanted to offer the smallest reward possible. The protagonist, for his part, couldn't understand why they were so interested in him. Later that same day, the protagonist left the palace and immediately ran into a man holding a spear who shouted excitedly when he saw him. The man claimed to be the best warrior in the Aryan kingdom and spoke enthusiastically, saying that now that the protagonist had received an important title and the king's recognition, many people would come looking for him, some wanting to work with him, and others even offering their daughters to marry him. According to the man, it would be a long time before he could walk the streets like before, without being noticed. That made him quite unhappy. All he wanted was freedom and a peaceful life, without constant interruptions. The next day, he went to meet his brothers for the wedding. He noticed they seemed a bit down, and they quickly explained why. They hadn't received any gifts from Kurt. All they got was a letter apologizing, saying he had no money. That was complicated, since a lack of gifts could be seen as a sign of disrespect from Eric. On top of that, the bride wouldn't be bringing any gifts either, and since his brothers were only guards in service to the lord of the city, the same one the protagonist served, they couldn't afford anything too flashy. The protagonist immediately understood their tough situation and decided to help by buying more impressive gifts. Thanks to that, Eric was able to get married without any issues. After the ceremony, Arterio approached the protagonist. Noticing that he looked a bit bored, he handed him something he'd asked for, though he didn't really understand why. It was a type of rice, and the protagonist was pleased to receive it. Without wasting any time, he went straight home with his friends and asked them to help him prepare miso. He'd been wanting to try that dish again for a long time, but had never been able to find the necessary ingredients. With the help of his friends and using his magic, he sped up the fermentation of the miso, avoiding having to wait an entire year. And so, he finally got to taste a dish he'd missed for so long. That made him genuinely happy. Even though he wasn't a fan of the nobility, he was already thinking about how he could use his position to help other people. and also enjoy the little things he'd never had access to in the lifestyle he was born into. A few days later, he was invited to a ceremony organized by the Cardinal of Hohenheim. The Cardinal thanked him for coming and struck up a conversation. In return, the protagonist gave him a gift as a token of appreciation. In the middle of their conversation, the Cardinal's granddaughter entered the hall. Her name was Elis Ohem Hein. The moment he saw her, he could sense that she had a strong magical power. The Cardinal, unsurprised, explained that his granddaughter had the gift of healing. The protagonist was impressed, since he himself could only use purification magic and couldn't heal wounds. He imagined that Ellis must help a lot of sick people. Jen confirmed this, saying she really did help many people at the church. Though he didn't want his granddaughter to become a nun, his wish was for her to get married. Lightly, the protagonist joked that she must have many suitors. The Cardinal confirmed, saying that several nobles had already asked for her hand. Playfully, the protagonist remarked that maybe he should join the line as well. Jogan Fine replied that he would even consider it, but the protagonist quickly reminded them that both were still underage and couldn't marry yet. They should enjoy their last years of single life before thinking about that. Even so, the Cardinal said the agreement was sealed. The protagonist protested, thinking it was all just a joke, but now he was engaged to the Cardinal's granddaughter, known as the Saint of the Hohenheim family. Later, the Cardinal had a private conversation with his servant, who praised the strategy of uniting his granddaughter with someone so powerful. Even though the protagonist didn't have a high noble rank, the title of Alton King was enough to give him great prestige. Moreover, the Cardinal remembered that they now had even more wealth thanks to the reward from defeating the undead dragon. Meanwhile, the protagonist told the news to his companions and his brother. He said he was engaged but didn't feel very good about it, since he'd barely spoken to Ellis. For the others, this was nothing new. His own brother said he had only met his wife on their wedding day, which was quite common among nobles. Hearing that, the protagonist got visibly upset, even though he still planned to leave the capital. After a while, he decided to go out in disguise as a clown, just so he could walk the streets unnoticed. But the result was the opposite. He drew even more attention. Along with Elvin, he went to buy some gifts to give to Alice. When they left the store, he recognized the same soldier with a spear from before, the one who always asked for a job. He tried to hide, but it didn't work. The boy recognized him even in disguise and ran up to him saying he looked different, but that it was impossible not to recognize the hero who had defeated the dragon. The protagonist asked him to lower his voice, but it was too late. The people around them started whispering. To get away, he teleported out of there with Elvin. Back home, he was frustrated with the situation. He couldn't even go out to buy something without being surrounded by people asking to work for him. His brother suggested he hire someone just to refuse those requests. Elvin volunteered for it, and the protagonist thought it was a good idea. He left that task in his hands and left, leaving Elvin surprised. Now he officially worked for the protagonist, and he didn't imagine it would be so easy to get that position. Next, the protagonist teleported to the Cardinal's cemetery, but ended up being discovered by Hohenheim, since he appeared very close to his window. He tried to hide, but Ellis was the one who found him. He then took her to the rooftop, saying he wanted to talk about the engagement. Just the two of them. She agreed and said she wasn't surprised by her grandfather's choice. The protagonist, on the other hand, didn't understand how she could accept it so easily since they barely knew each other. Ellis replied that everyone already knew his reputation, the hero who defeated the great dragon, and that becoming his wife would be something she would be very proud of. The protagonist was surprised by her honesty. He thought she might be being forced, but seeing the calm way she acted, he felt more at ease with the situation. That night, Elvin told the other two group members that he now worked for the protagonist. This meant he could give orders there. One of the companions was surprised, but said she also wanted to work for the protagonist. Elvin promised he would talk to him, and then give an answer to see if they could really stay there. Louise hoped this could really happen. After all, the protagonist really wanted those women to be his subordinate. However, he got annoyed because he didn't believe it was possible, and couldn't stand the companion's attitude. So he suggested to Suzanne that they find a way to have the protagonist with them without Elvin interfering. After thinking for a bit, Louise thought the best way would be for them to become the protagonist's concubine. To Louise, this made sense because if they were his concubines, he could marry Ellis without complication. That way, they would be by the protagonist's side, no longer under Elvin's command but as his companion. At that moment, the protagonist arrived but didn't pay much attention to what they were saying and soon went to eat after being told dinner was ready. That night, the protagonist received an invitation from Lise to have dinner the next day. Still, he managed to hear the argument between his two companions who were trying to find a way to win him over. The next day, the protagonist had dinner with Ellis. The moment was a bit awkward because neither of them knew what to say, so they decided to talk only about the food, commenting that it looked very good. When they finished and were about to leave, the butler explained that on the first meeting, it's customary to seal the agreement with a gift or proof of commitment. So they quickly went to a city craftsman who showed several types of rings worthy of royalty. The protagonist looked at the rings, but none seemed ideal for him. They were very valuable, which puzzled him. Then, he noticed a ring that was apart from the others and looked perfect. The seller tried to convince him it wasn't the best choice, but the protagonist didn't care about the price and bought the ring. From Elise's expression, he knew she would like it. Later, the two returned by carriage, and Ellis thanked him for the ring because she realized it had a magical crystal in it. The protagonist said he hadn't noticed that, but chose the ring because he thought it would be suitable for her at that moment. Then, he decided to share that he didn't like being called a hero because he wanted to be a normal person, without the pressure that such a title brings. He imagined Ellis must feel the same, since she had been called a saint since she was very young. So, he understood that she must have gone through a lot of pressure as well. Remembering that the ring had a magical crystal, they decided to test what would happen if it were imbued with mana. At that moment, the ring began to glow and lit up the entire room, leaving the protagonist and Alice surprised as they watched the light spread along the way back home. That night, the cardinal asked the butler what he thought of the protagonist. The butler replied that it was hard to give a clear opinion since the boy was very different from the other. He didn't treat Ellis in the usual way when they knew she was a saint, but treated her like a normal girl when he was with her. This made it difficult for them to understand the protagonist's intentions. After a few days, when the holidays in the capital were ending, the protagonist received a visit from his companions, who were surprised because they didn't expect her to come to them. They said the protagonist was at the palace, but she explained she had come to talk and wanted to know more about her fiancé. Then, the protagonist appeared before the king, who explained that he had a special mission for him and Blank Tack. There were many food resources at a bus stop nearby, but it was not possible to collect them yet because an ancient dragon surrounded that area and needed to be eliminated. Since they were mages, they had the ability to affect the breath of dragon. Although the protagonist wasn't very excited knowing that only the two of them would go on the mission, at that moment, the door opened and a strong man entered. Blant recognized him immediately and greeted him. Then, the man also greeted the protagonist, saying he was excited to meet him. He said it was impressive that, at the protagonist's age, he had defeated an undead dragon. He also informed the king that they would leave immediately to take down that dragon. Blantak explained to the protagonist that the man was Krop, the leader of the palace mages, and the protagonist noticed the great magical power emanating from Krop. A few minutes later, they went to the place where the dragon was. Kristoff explained that once they arrived, they would plan a strategy to defeat the monster quickly. Meanwhile, Rich asked the protagonist's companions to send a message from the palace. When the protagonist and his group eliminated the dragon, the monsters that were hiding because of its presence would be released and start attacking nearby cities. Therefore, they asked them to form a team to exterminate those monsters. Normally, the nobles of the region would do this, but if they left it to them, the nobles would demand land and other rewards. Since the king preferred that the protagonist handle this, knowing he wouldn't make unreasonable demands, and since an army did not yet exist, Elvin was put in charge of recruiting soldiers to fight alongside the protagonist. This scared the boy, but Eric promised to help him, and also mentioned that commanding wouldn't be too difficult, as there were many warriors outside the house, eager to show their strength and work with the protagonist. A few hours later, Elvin was already marching with the entire army he had gathered in the city. They arrived at the camp and waited for the monsters to appear. That night, the young people were surprised to see Ellis there as well. She explained that they had asked the priests with healing magic to support them. Ellis said she also intended to pass through the area to look for the protagonist, but the others said he wasn't there, as he should be preparing to face the dragon the next morning. The next day, the protagonist arrived at the site along with Krop and Blant Tack. Krop was the first to act. He activated his magical armor, summoned a grenade, and charged at the dragon, starting the fight. The protagonist and Blant Tack watched in surprise at how Krop fought. The magical armor protected him even more than a barrier and greatly increased his physical power. Blant Tack warned that they needed to be careful because that armor consumed a lot of magical power. He guessed that Krop was trying to weaken the dragon so the protagonist could deliver the final blow. After a few minutes of combat, Kristoff gave the signal, and the protagonist concentrated all his magical energy, wishing to return home quickly. With a powerful attack, he managed to eliminate the dragon. Later, the three approached the monster's body, and the protagonist put the dragon in his bag. Blant Tack congratulated him on how quickly they finished the mission, and the protagonist replied that he acted fast because he knew they wouldn't get much reward. Despite everything, the mages still insisted on encouraging our protagonist because parts of that dragon were very valuable and could bring in a good amount of money. This motivated him since the mission was accomplished. However, Kristoff only smiled and warned that the hardest moment was about to come. Our protagonist replied that, in the end, the The monsters that would come would be just weak enemy. Blanar, however, reminded them that Alfred had died precisely because he faced a huge number of monsters, which managed to defeat them a few hours later. At the battle camp, Ellis was busy with the priests taking care of the wounded arriving from the battlefield. Everyone called her the church's saint and felt relieved knowing she was there to heal them, especially since many priests were already out of mana. While helping, Ellis heard the soldiers thanking the frontline fighters because thanks to them, the number of injured was lower. Still, they commented that the monsters were very strong and the situation was chaotic. As the hours passed, Ellis began to feel tired from using so much mana, feeling her strength decrease quickly. When she tried to cast magic again, she noticed her ring glowing, granting her an extra energy reserve to keep healing. This way, she managed to help all the wounded until very late at night. Then, she decided to go out and rest a little. At that moment, a soldier approached her with a smile, praising her commitment to the Dragon Slayer hero, a very brave warrior who fought at the front against the monsters. The soldier said that ever since the protagonist arrived as the hero, all the soldiers had been encouraged. It was an honor for him to know that Ellis was engaged to someone so powerful. Ellis remembered that the protagonist had told her everyone treated him like a hero, but he just wanted to be a normal person. She knew that if he was fighting on the front line without giving up, she should also keep helping the wounded, even if she ran out of mana. Besides, she had some medical knowledge that helped keep the injured alive. Amid all this activity, the next day arrived. Ellis was still healing those in need when a soldier came shouting that the front troops had won the battle. The news cheered everyone, but soon another soldier asked for help because Mr. Brown Mare was injured. Alarmed, Ellis ran thinking it was the protagonist, but when she got there, she saw it was a brother, as our hero was fine and uninjured. Despite all her effort, exhaustion made Ellis faint. A few hours later, she woke up beside the protagonist, who wanted to bring her something, but Ellis declined. She told him that now he should understand that he was not a hero, but an ordinary person. He replied that she wasn't a saint either, but from the beginning, he had heard many soldiers praising the saint who healed them. That gave him courage because there was a sense of solidarity there, and he realized that titles were not as important as the words they said to people. At that moment, Kristoff ran to Ellis and hugged her. The protagonist was confused, but Plantag explained that Kristoff was Ellis's uncle. A few days later, the protagonist decided to move to the capital because the lord of the city asked him to live there. He had been promoted to masculine and, together with his classmates, was going to enter the capital's academy. That was why they were finishing the move. It was also the opportunity for Susan and Louise to officially become concubines, as Elise had no problem with it. Now they would all live together in the same house because Elise would be the official fiancée, and they needed to get along to work well together. A few days later, the protagonist attended the wedding of one of his brothers, who was going to join the knight's family. There, his brother Eric said many people were paying attention to them because they were the count's brothers with the power to defeat dragons. Because of that, they asked if he was ready for the tournament that would happen soon. Our protagonist asked what it was about, since he didn't know about the tournament. Eric explained that every 3 years, there was a physical arts tournament with 3 combat styles: sword, spear, or hand-to-hand fighting. It was an event to test the warrior's skills. The protagonist wanted to know if magic was involved, and Eric said no, that he should use the sword, since nobles were at least known for knowing how to use them. The protagonist said then he would have to use magic enhancer, but Eric warned that those were forbidden. In the tournament, what mattered was sword mastery, and they expected the protagonist not to disgrace his reputation. Meanwhile, the protagonist's companions finished their training. Elvin was exhausted because he couldn't keep up with the 2 girls, who improved their physical conditioning with mana. After training, they went to rest, and Blank Tag told them about the tournament. He explained that as workers and adventurers in the protagonist's group, they should participate. However, it wasn't mandatory to win. It was enough to win at least one fight and show talent with the sword. Elvin didn't think it was important, but Blank Tag insisted he should take it seriously. If he wasn't good enough, he could be kicked out of the group, something Blank knew well, having dismissed several members before for lack of competence. That night, the protagonist talked with everyone around the table about the tournament they were going to compete in. He was happy to learn that the champion of the last tournaments wouldn't participate, as he was now an instructor, which was an advantage for him who could try to advance further. Also, he suggested that Ellis join the adventurer group. The girls agreed since she would be very useful with her healing magic. The protagonist noticed that Elvin was thoughtful while they ate. The boy said it was no problem for Ellis to join the group and assured that they would do everything to win the tournament. In the following days, the protagonist trained with his teammate. Everyone noticed that Elvin was much more motivated and trained very hard, easily surpassing the protagonist, who still had difficulty adapting to the training. After a few days, the protagonist said that the winner of the last tournaments would participate as a judge and that the king had ordered that he be the worthy winner. That is, he had to defeat defeat that champion to be recognized. This disappointed Elvin, who had trained hard, but that night he decided to give up. The girls went to his room to find out why he was quitting, but Elvin said he couldn't beat an army commander, which was frustrating since he couldn't use magic. If he couldn't win the tournament, he would be a burden to the group and wouldn't help the protagonist at all. The girls tried to convince him otherwise, but Elvin asked them to leave him alone, saying they wouldn't understand how hard he was trying. The next morning, because of the limits he had pushed his body to the day before, Elvin found our protagonist in the hall and wanted to know if he would be okay, even if he didn't win the tournament. But when he realized he was sleeping, Elvin quickly woke him up. Our protagonist apologized, explaining that he hadn't been sleeping well because he knew Elisa was very worried. She had started training secretly every morning to improve her physical conditioning so she could fight alongside them. This surprised Elvin. He thought to himself that if someone with as much magical power as Elisa felt she could improve, he should also try his best in the fights. A few days later, the day of the tournament arrived and everyone prepared to compete. Our protagonist was ready, his friends were excited, but in the first duel, he would have to face Warren. This made him nervous because he knew it wouldn't be easy, but he decided to at least try. However, when the fight started, Warren won with just one move, and thus our protagonist was immediately eliminated. Meanwhile, the two girls managed to advance through some rounds, but didn't get past the initial trap. Suzanne did much better and ended up defeated by a soldier who often asked for help from our protagonist. This surprised her, because the boy revealed he had an impressive skill with the spear. They started talking while Vin advanced through the preliminary rounds, reaching the final. However, in the last fight, he suffered an arm injury, and his next opponent would be Warren, who seemed eager to face him. A few minutes later, the two friends of our protagonist took care of Elvin's wound, but the fight supervisor recommended that he not continue fighting to avoid worsening the injury. The girls told Elvin that Blank Tag was being very harsh by demanding so much from him, but Elvin didn't agree. He thought that since he didn't have magic, he had to work even harder to stay in the group. They gave him the food Elisa had prepared, since our protagonist also spent the whole night preparing something special to encourage everyone. He had seen them so motivated in training that he decided to find a way to give them extra energy, and noticing this, Elvin became very excited. Then he quickly grabbed his sword and declared he would fight in the final, because he didn't want to disappoint our protagonist, and promised to give his best until the end of the tournament. After 3 years in Kurt's territory, his wife visited him at work to tell him they had received a letter and an informant from the capital. Kurt didn't even want to open the letter, imagining it would be about his younger brother who was very famous. But he wasn't interested in the proposals he always received to give the territory to his brother. So he handed the letter to his wife. When she opened it, she was shocked. The letter said that our protagonist had died while investigating ancient ruins. A few days later, our protagonist was happy to turn 15 because now he could officially become an adventurer. Together with his companions, he registered at the guild and began looking through all the available missions. Then Blantak approached them with a letter containing a mission to explore some ancient ruins. He couldn't refuse, as it was a direct order from the king. Hours later, our protagonist, his group, and Blantak entered the ruins. The wizard explained that they were chosen because since the ruins were discovered, many adventurers had been sent there, ranging from beginners who never returned to experienced ones who also failed to leave that place. For that reason, the king and soldiers decided to close off the ruins until they understood what was going on. Some rumors said there was a dragon inside. They chose our protagonist because of his good reputation fighting monsters like that. Of course, it's always the protagonist who has to sacrifice the group, he thought, feeling no better. Now he would have to face this mission while watching his group get scared at the idea of facing a dragon. Blantak tried to calm them, saying he didn't sense any monsters nearby. The wizard opened a door that led to a room full of crystals, but as soon as everyone entered, the floor lit up, and they became paralyzed. Blantak told them to try to escape, but no one could move, and one by one, they began to disappear. Minutes later, Elisa woke up and saw that all her companions were okay, which relieved her a lot. She found them, and Vontan explained that they had been taken by an ancient magic to the deepest part of the ruins, something common in traps created by old wizards. Now they needed to find a way back to the surface. Louise said it would be easy with our protagonist's teleportation magic, but he explained that he couldn't use it because he needed to know exactly where he was and where he wanted to go. So the only way out was to climb the stairs and face whatever they encountered along the way. Later, as they climbed, our protagonist and the others saw a door closing behind them. Ahead, there was a large group of soldiers armed with armor. They knew they would have to fight. Our protagonist prepared himself, but his friends said they should be the ones to fight since they had no idea how long they would stay down there and needed to save energy. The guys started the battle, and our protagonist with Blantak used magic only for support, while Elisa used her magic to heal the wounded. After several minutes of a tough battle, they managed to defeat all the enemy. Looking around, they noticed skeletons on the floor, supposedly from adventurers who had come before them. At that moment, Louise heard a strange sound and looked toward the stairs, seeing more monsters approaching. He warned that they would have to keep fighting even harder. 5 days later, the king was talking with Kristoff, worried about our protagonist and his group because they hadn't heard from them, and rumors were starting to grow. This was a known problem, and the cardinal, who had heard rumors that his granddaughter and fiancé had died, showed no weakness, fully trusting the couple. Meanwhile, Logner's brother, who was in charge of finances, spread the false news of our protagonist's group's death, wanting to gain more power. He was the one who sent the messenger with the letter to Kurt, hoping the protagonist's domains would be divided among others. But if our protagonist was still alive, his plans would be ruined. Meanwhile, our protagonist and his friends kept fighting without giving up. They were exhausted and very weak, as they could only sleep a few hours while the others kept fighting against those endless hordes invading the ruins. Still, they pressed on, believing that each floor they climbed could be the last. Elvin was very tired, and Ellis used her magic to heal him, even though he resisted because he didn't want to die there. He at least wanted a chance to face Warren again. Ellis didn't want to die there either. She was using a considerable part of her magic to help eliminate the remaining enemies from the horde, hoping they could leave that place soon. Together, they continued climbing the stairs. Ellis said they had to return alive to the surface because she still had many things to do before dying. Our protagonist agreed with her, saying they were right. They entered a room where they didn't sense any dangerous presence, and Elvin was happy, believing they had finally won. But Plantag noticed there was a dragon golem in that place and quickly created a shield to protect them just in time before they were hit. At that moment, a group of robots attacked them from behind, injuring Suzanne. Our protagonist, who was with Black Tag, used magic to protect them from the dragon's attacks, while Elvin and Louise fought the robot. Ellis took care of Suzanne, healing her wounds. She knew that the way they wouldn't last long. The only option was to try to defeat the dragon, but Plantag thought it was difficult since his power was almost at its limit. Then our protagonist had an idea. He proposed that they combine their magic, and Plantag agreed, placing his hands on the protagonist's back and passing all his magical power to him. The protagonist felt the energy flow and cast a light spell against the dragon. Although the spell wasn't strong enough to cause much damage, the dragon began to weaken. Plantag could barely stand, exhausted, but told the protagonist that he reminded him of his own apprentice. Hearing that, the protagonist pushed himself to attack with all his magic, but still couldn't surpass the dragon's power. At that moment, Ellis ran up to him and said she would use a spell called Miraculous Light. She approached the protagonist and kissed him. Everyone was shocked, and the protagonist saw Ellis collapse to the ground, weak, but her body was taken over by an incredible light. With a strong flash, she pierced the dragon, defeating it and disabling all the remaining robots. After that, the protagonist fell to the ground beside Ellis, powerless. A few hours later, he woke up in a bed next to her, while the girls talked about the kiss she had given and whether it was really necessary for the spell. A few minutes later, he managed to get up and talked with Blant Tak, who explained that this place had been built by an ancient wizard. He had designed all those artifacts and robots to protect his knowledge because there was a huge library full of magical books there. Elvin arrived at that moment and called the protagonist, taking him to a room full of powerful magical ships, many of which had never been seen together. However, Elvin revealed that there was something even more impressive. Activating a mechanism, he opened a huge door that showed the exit to the surface. The protagonist was happy because this meant that they had managed to overcome the ruins and could now return home. After a day, the protagonist met the king. He told them everything they had done and showed them what they had brought back from the ruins: the remains of the armor, the dragon mithril, and the books of the wizard's knowledge. After analyzing, the king decided to give each of them a reward of 2 million gold coins, which would be paid gradually over 20 years. The kingdom would see to it that everything was done correctly. A little later, the protagonist spoke to Kristoff and explained that he had spoken to his companions and decided to leave the capital because he preferred to live far away from so many problems. Kristoff understood and promised to find out who spread the rumors about his death, since this worried the people a lot. The companions also told the protagonist that they would not accept the entire reward, as they thought it was too much for them. They felt that they had not done much and did not want to carry the responsibility, preferring that the protagonist, who remained their leader, keep the money. The protagonist was surprised, as he hadn't expected them to decide to leave everything to him, and now he had one more thing to worry about. Shortly after, he got together to eat with his friends and felt that someone was spying on him. He told them about this, saying that it would be good to leave someone in charge of the mansion, since, after everything that had happened, it wouldn't be strange if they tried to attack that place. It would also be good if someone took good care of the mansion while he was away. But he didn't know who to trust with this task. Suzanne told him he had just the right person, Roderick, a strong soldier who could take on any invader. Besides, Roderick had always been a great admirer of them and would be happy to help. The protagonist called Roderick and made him an offer to take care of the mansion. Roderick accepted immediately, without hesitation. He had been waiting for this opportunity for more than 3 years and promised to do whatever was asked. The protagonist was happy with the decision and wanted to celebrate with a cake. While they were eating, Louise felt a strange presence watching them again, but she couldn't find anything. Roderick warned that it was not safe for the protagonist to continue living there, because there were people against him. The protagonist knew this and decided that he would leave soon. He finished some pending matters while Roderick promised to find out who started the rumors about his death. Shortly after, the protagonist went to a special research room where they used the runes he had obtained from the ancient ruins. Thus, they created a device that would attract something they imagined. Although it consumed a lot of magical power, the protagonist asked permission to use it because he needed something special. We realized that the girl who had been spying on them was still watching them that afternoon. Later, the protagonist organized a banquet to thank everyone who helped him while he was in the city, also inviting several nobles and aristocrats from the kingdom. This did not surprise Blant Tak, who knew the protagonist well. After a while, he appeared with a table full of tuna, which he offered to everyone to enjoy, thanks to the machine they used in the royal laboratory. He also brought several soy sauces that he had been making for years and were ready to serve. The guests were a little surprised, as they had never tasted anything like it, but one by one they tried it and enjoyed the flavor. A few minutes later, Roderick confirmed to the protagonist that he had discovered who had spread the rumors about his death: the auditor, the brother of the kingdom's financial officer. It seems that Lugner's brother's idea was to use his own death to gain allies and take his brother's place, since the relationship between the two was never good, and it got even worse after the financial director started supporting Lugner. Our protagonist was surprised to learn that his brother planned all of this, even without knowing him well. Roderick then explained that the auditor sent a letter to the protagonist's family informing them of his death. He also mentioned that the messenger left a few days ago and would soon arrive with this news. Lugner's brother's plan was to use the protagonist's family to overthrow his brother, but Roderick assured him that he didn't need to worry about that anymore because he had already taken action. He spread the rumor that the auditor had conspired against the protagonist to eliminate him. Because of this, the king summoned him, and even though he wasn't sure, it seemed that the auditor would pay for his actions. Roderick also said that he wouldn't spread false rumors anymore. The protagonist was impressed that he had managed to unravel all. Roderick said he suspected something, since the auditor was his father, although he had never officially recognized him as his legitimate son. His mother was a merchant who was not even accepted as a concubine. Therefore, he learned that you can't trust someone just because they share the same blood. While they were talking about this, Ellis appeared offering a special dish. The girl who had been spying on them for a while decided to come in at once, breaking down the door and going straight to where they were. Elvin tried to stop her, but she easily overcame him. When he got close to the protagonist, he began to eat the dish that Eliza had brought. At that moment, Marshal Edgar appeared, calling the girl by her name, Etal, and apologized for not having introduced her earlier. She was his daughter. Edgar asked her what she thought of the protagonist. She admitted that she had been spying, but confirmed that he fed his companions well, so she approved. However, now she wanted more food. Eliza heard this and took her to prepare something better. Blant Tak arrived shortly after and explained that Etal has a kind of hero syndrome. Her body and muscles are constantly receiving magical power, making her strength unbeatable. Edgar commented that the problem was that she consumed a lot of magical power and needed to eat all the time, something that didn't seem like a problem to the protagonist, who loved food and offered to hire her as his personal guard, or even to have her as his wife if he wanted. The protagonist thanked her, but thought he didn't need a guard with so much power, since he planned to live hunting in the other city. At that moment, Duke Blade approached him with a request if he would like to live in his city. Meanwhile, Kurta heard from his wife about the protagonist's death and that his son would take over all male positions. This made Kurta somewhat happy, but his wife, frightened, looked out the window and saw the protagonist arriving with his companions. Shortly after, the protagonist sat before his brother Kurt, along with his ally. He explained that he had been on a mission given by the king about 15 years ago to command part of the army of that province to attack a region of the evil forest. The battle had cost the lives of many soldiers, who now roamed as undead. The king asked the protagonist, with his group, to go there to eliminate the monsters and purify the undead before they turned into lich. Kurt said that this part of the forest was his property, and that the protagonist should pay tribute, normally 30% of what he earned, but now he wanted 50%. This surprised many people, as he was demanding too much. He also tried to ease the suffering of the soldiers who had died, saying that even if they tried to retrieve their belongings, it didn't matter, as the soldiers had already been given a proper burial. Being from the provinces, they didn't have any valuable. Ellis objected, saying that without purifying the souls, the funerals were useless, and offered to help perform new rituals once the undead soldiers were purified. Kurt, however, angrily replied that he would only do so if he received money, and did not agree with the idea. Finally, They agreed to pay the tribute he demanded in order to enter the forest. Elvin was very upset with the way Kurt treated them, but the protagonist soon calmed him down and asked his brother to talk to the city and the leaders to get the best possible deal. That night, Kurt met with several local leaders, who excitedly asked if the protagonist had returned to purify his relatives in the forest. Kurt replied that there was no reason to be excited, as his brother was only there as an adventurer and would be leaving soon. Even so, he felt angry just thinking about it. The protagonist, in turn, couldn't help but wonder if Kurt had always hated him so much. One of the brothers explained that, ever since the protagonist left and earned his reputation by killing many people, Kurt had become increasingly paranoid, afraid that he would steal the inheritance that was due to him. The protagonist said he would never do something like that, but Marlene, Kurt's wife, said she was happy to know that the soldiers would be purified, since her grandfather was one of them. If he wanted to remember his grandfather, the protagonist promised to do everything he could to ensure that he rested in peace. Marlene thanked him profusely, but regretted that the protagonist was not the ruler of the region. This conversation worried the protagonist's brother, as Kurt shouldn't hear this kind of comment. After hearing everything, the protagonist decided to finish the mission as quickly as possible and leave soon. The next day, he and his companions entered the forest and began to attract the undead little by little. Some appeared, and combining his power with Ellis's, the protagonist created a large barrier around everyone. Thus, when the undead soldiers approached and touched the barrier, they were automatically purified. Elvin was a little disappointed, thinking that they shouldn't do much, and started collecting armor so that the relatives would have some souvenir. The protagonist even saw the army general being purified as soon as he touched the barrier, but they still hadn't seen Marlene's grandfather. Suddenly, a giant wire broke through the barrier, surprising the young people, as it was an undead monster. Ital, using his weapon, advanced against it and managed to cut off its head with a single blow. With that, the body began to purify itself, but as it was very large, it took longer than the others. Several other undead monsters also approached the barrier. Some were purified, but others managed to pass through. The companions were responsible for defeating them before they approached the protagonist. After several hours, they managed to kill almost all of them. Then the protagonist announced that there was only one left. He realized it was Marlene's grandfather because his armor was different from the others. At that moment, they approached him, surprised to realize that he could still speak. The old man asked how his granddaughter was, and our protagonist replied that she was living a happy life and was already married. This brought obvious joy to the soldier, who then dropped his weapon and asked, in a weak voice, for them to purify him. It was then that Elise used her purifying magic, allowing the old man's soul to rest in peace, at least for a while. After that, they returned to the city and handed over the soldiers' belongings. The family members gathered to receive the last trace of those warriors, deeply thanking our protagonist for bringing peace to their hearts. They finally knew that those soldiers had rested in peace. At that moment, Kurt appeared and said that once the farewells were over, all the armor should be delivered to the blacksmith. In his province, iron was rare and could not be wasted. Our protagonist, irritated, made an internal comment about how he understood the sentimental value of those pieces to the families, even though Kurt just insisted that it was an order to be followed. Our protagonist could not contain himself and intervened, saying that they could not take away from them what represented the most precious memory of their loved ones. Kurt, however, replied that he was just an adventurer and should not challenge the province owner's decisions. The protagonist then questioned if Kurt had enough iron, if he would still take off the armor, and he admitted that he would not. With that, the protagonist took a huge iron cube out of his bag, hoping that it would be enough to compensate for the armor and allow people to keep the memory of their family member. After all this, Albert left, clearly irritated at being confronted like that. He expected the protagonist to leave soon, while the residents continued to thank him for everything he had done for them. Later, the protagonist received a visit from Duke H, who informed him that they would be assessing the armor of the 2,000 soldiers they had brought with them, a process that would take time, so they suggested that he return to his family's province while they finished their reconnaissance, though the protagonist preferred to wait elsewhere. Blantac agreed with him. They went to the protagonist's brother's house, while the Duke spoke with a general, assuring him that everything was going according to plan. At that moment, the protagonist was received by the former mayor of the city, who surprised him. The protagonist soon understood the situation and was invited to the funeral that was to be held in honor of those who had been purified that afternoon. Ellis led the farewell prayer, while several people at the ceremony whispered about the fact that Kur had not shown up to say goodbye. Later, they organized a banquet in honor of the soldiers. During the meal, the protagonist saw Amelie, Kurt's wife, saying goodbye to some soldiers accompanied by her 2 children. When Kurt heard all of this, he became furious. He spilled the drink they were drinking on the floor and shouted that he had known from the beginning that his brother wanted to steal everything their father had left and take full control of the land. The protagonist tried to explain that he only wanted to keep the parts that were not very valuable, just to to ensure a peaceful life for himself and his family. But Kurt, full of rage, ordered him to leave the castle immediately, stating that he would never allow him to take anything that was his. Upon leaving the castle, the protagonist encountered Amelia and her children. He apologized, saying that all he wanted was to prevent anyone from getting hurt. Still, it seemed that no matter what he did, he would have to follow the palace's orders. Amelia understood the situation, and so she let her children come closer to him. For her, the most important thing was that they have a decent life, and she hoped that when he finally took over the land, he would consider their well-being. A few hours later, while preparing mayonnaise, the protagonist spoke to his companions, explaining that he had already made a decision. He would become the lord of the province. However, he did not want to be just a piece of the palace. He needed everyone's support to create a plan in which no one would be hurt or lose their life. Over the next few hours, he and his allies began selling various products in the city: food, clothes, and weapons, gaining the attention of the people, who were impressed by the quality. But that same night, Kurt and his leaders appeared to stop the sale, as this was taking away the trade of several of their products. This, in turn, made the population increasingly closer to the protagonist, which made Kurt even more furious. One of the leaders suggested eliminating the protagonist, but Kurt said that would be impossible, since he was a wizard who had even defeated a dragon. None of them would stand a chance against him. Even so, Kurt ordered them to find a way to make the protagonist leave the region. Shortly after, the protagonist intercepted 3 of the leaders who were next to Kurt, and did not let them leave, because he also had a plan with them. The next day, Kurt was informed that he had lost 3 of his leaders. Meanwhile, the protagonist was in the city of Blage, talking to Roderick, explaining that his plan was already in motion. Thanks to the trade and bribes he made with Kurt's leaders, they could now train better, and because of this, many of them were leaving Kurt to seek a better future. This would make Kurt explode with anger. They also planned to visit the house where the protagonist wanted Amelia and her children to live. Afterwards, the protagonist went to the church, where Roderick commented that, after what had happened, Kurt should live a life of prayer and reflection. This would make it difficult for the palace to act against him, since he would have the protection of the church. The protagonist hoped that his brother would understand the whole plan, since it was all for his own good. Roderick also said that everything was going according to plan at the mansion, where several nobles were showing interest in the land project. They hoped that the problems would be resolved soon so they could take action. While they were talking, the protagonist's brother sent a messenger to Kurt's house. Kurt was surprised to see that all the leaders loyal to him had abandoned his side because of the protagonist's proposals. Enraged, Kurt grabbed a knife, ready to solve the problem with violence. But the messenger said that this would not work, and that it would be better to offer a flute known as the Dragon Slayer, which could easily defeat the protagonist. Kurt asked who had made the flute, and the messenger explained that it was used to summon dragons, and that with it he could easily defeat his brother. In return, the auditor only wanted Kurt to cooperate with him when he officially became lord of the province. Kurt was happy to have allies and promised to give the auditor what he deserved once he eliminated his brother. A few hours later, the protagonist went to Kurt, who was in the middle of the forest. He pretended to be surprised to see him, but Kurt said he didn't need to pretend, because he knew his brother was accompanied by his group, who showed up when called. Kurt laughed, remembering that he had always been bothered by his younger brother's prominence, but that, despite this, they couldn't take the inheritance from him, because it belonged to his older brother. Kurt took the flute out of his pocket, and Blant was startled when he saw it, because he recognized it. He explained that it was an ancient relic capable of summoning hundreds of dragons at the same time. The protagonist warned that using the flute would not only kill him, but also many residents of the town, including his own family. Kurt replied that he didn't care because the city had betrayed him by supporting his brother. If he lost his family, he would find another one later. Blant, angry, insulted Kurt, and he became even more angry, trying to attack. However, the flute created a protection around Kurt, who became excited when he saw that they could not defeat him. So, he began to play the instrument. The sky darkened, and a dark atmosphere enveloped Kurt. The protagonist tried to go to it, but Edel stopped him, sensing a very evil presence. Blant said that the flute was not really a dragon flute, as he found it strange that someone like Kurt had obtained such a rare object. In fact, he was playing a flute of resentment, capable of summoning evil spirits that dominated whoever played it. Ellis, using purifying magic, tried to eliminate the evil, but there were too many concentrated spirits. After a few seconds, the protagonist reacted. He tried his best for his brother, but now he needed to stop those who wanted to cause harm. Combining his magic with Ellis's, he launched a powerful purifying blast that completely eliminated the golem. However, one of the spirits, full of resentment for having been deceived, went to the house of the auditor Lunar, where he was celebrating the success of his plans with a banquet. The spirit touched him right there. The next day, the protagonist went to Roderick, who explained that the auditor had been the one who gave Kurt the flute. He was killed that night, along with several other noble allies who planned to attack the protagonist. This left the protagonist upset to see that his brother had been tricked. Roderick said that there was a problem. Kurt's wife could not live in the city, as many rumored that Kurt had eliminated the auditor. If they found out that Amelia was in town, it would cause a lot of trouble. The protagonist knew this and decided to leave Amelia Amelia and the children for a few days at her brother Germain's house. He also spoke with Blanchetac and Christophe, as he didn't know what to do, since in the province Amelia was also not very well regarded because of Kurt's bad reputation among the population. Blanchetac didn't have a definitive answer, but he began to imagine that the palace might be involved with the flute that Kur had obtained. This bothered our protagonist a lot, because he knew that nobles tend to act this way, always doing things without taking full responsibility. But Blanchetac advised him not to think so, reminding him that he was also a nobleman, someone who, in many situations, was above others and acted without feeling the need to explain his plans to everyone. These words left our protagonist thoughtful. Later that night, he talked to Ellis, wanting to know if she believed the same thing Blanchetac had told her. Ellis replied that sometimes she had the feeling that, even though he was close to her, he seemed to be somewhere else, very far away. Hearing this, he realized that he was still stuck in his old world, trying to solve everything the way he always did. So he made a promise to himself. From that moment on, he would be a better person and show that there were nobles who could do good without harming anyone. The next day, our protagonist went to the king. The king congratulated him for having managed to calm the riots in the province that belonged to his father. As a reward, he offered him the lands of that province so that he could administer and develop them. Afterwards, the king asked if he had anything to ask for, as he might need something. Our protagonist then asked if it would be possible to obtain the authority to grant 2 titles to the noble who had lost their lives at the auditor's banquet. Everyone was surprised because only the king had this power, to grant titles and inheritances. This sparked a discussion among the noble, who feared that this decision would cause confusion in the kingdom, with many wanting the same right. After a few minutes of debate, the king asked for silence and explained that he would not take any part of our protagonist's lands, as some had suggested. The province would remain entirely his. Furthermore, because of everything he had done to help in recent years, the king decided to make an exception, to allow him to inherit the titles and properties of 2 of the nobles who had died that day. This way, he could give these titles to whomever he wished. To top it all off, the king promoted our protagonist to the rank of count, so that he could govern his lands in the best possible way. Shortly after, the king was pleased to see that our protagonist was becoming an exemplary nobleman. He was also pleased that everything had gone according to plan, which caused arguments among the noble, who seemed to disagree. But in the end, the king hoped that he would become a good lord of that province. A few days later, our protagonist spoke to Amelia and said that when his children grew up, he intended to pass on to them the titles he had received from the king. That way, they would continue to be nobles, and he hoped they would lead a prosperous life. Amelia thanked him profusely for everything he had done for the family and reminded him that what happened to Kurt was not his fault. Even with all this, our protagonist continued working on organizing the lands of his province. He had a lot to do, using his magic, and his companions were always asking for help. Sometimes he didn't even know where to start, but at least he was happy to be able to be useful to the ones he loved the most.